Before we start day 5, let's talk about day4.py, which is my solution to day 4's exercise. Recall that in day 4, we needed to create a word counter in Python. The smart solution here is we actually use print and input functions that we've seen many times before to solicit input from the user. And the key function in this day4.py is the len function here and the split function here. So what this is we first take the sentence, which is the input. We apply a split function, and we specify that we split with spaces. After this code fragment here, this code fragment produces a list of all the words as defined by a split of spaces in the sentence. If we enter a sentence with 3 words, it's going to produce a list of 3 items. Leveraging this fact, we can then use the len function, which calculates the length of a list to see how many words there are. Ultimately, we then need to print out this length, and there we have our word counter.
We're starting a new day today about programming functions in Python. In this section, we're going to take a look at number 1, introducing functions. So what are functions and how do we create them in Python? How do we use functions in code in the second video? With functions, we also then need to understand the scope of variables or scoping of variables. We'll then conclude today by showing you some example code on what is scoping and how does it vary across a sample code file. So let's first dive into functions. In this video, we're going to take a look at functions in 3 steps. Number 1, what are functions? Number 2, declaring functions. And number 3, returning values. Let's go in and take a look. I'm back in my IPython and I have defined a function. So what is a function? You can imagine functions as a very small piece of code or very small Python program that you embed in a larger Python program. Much like normal Python programs, a function has inputs. It would do some logic to those inputs and it would output a return value. So let's dissect this in the context of Python. To create a function in Python, we first need to create what's called a function signature. So here we're defining a function, so DEF stands for defining a function, right? We then need to give a name to our function, and we're giving a name my function to our function. So the function naming rules are the same as the variable naming rules. So you cannot have a function that starts with a punctuation, a symbol, or any non-alphanumeric character apart from the underscore. You can use underscores within the function name, and that's pretty much the only non-alphabet character you should use in the function name. We then create an open bracket to define any parameters or any information or any inputs we want to allow our users to put into this function, and we close the parameter parentheses when we have finished defining all the inputs. In this particular my function, we do not have any inputs and we simply have a function name that somebody can call, and that's it. In the second line, we create a new statement block by again indenting whatever code that you want the function to execute by 4 spaces to the right. Here it's very easy. All we're doing is returning the number 1 or the integer 1, and by returning this we show that my function would output the number 1. So let's draw a parallel to a function we already know. So we've already tried the print function, which is like this. So here the print function is, well, called print, and inside the parentheses it accepts one argument, which is whatever that needs to be printed. If we were to define our own print function, then we will say def print and then thing to print, and then we'll have some code here to print thing to print into this screen, right? I can't do that because print is defined on a system-wide level and they're leveraging operational systems specific implementations of how to print things on the screen. So we can't define our own print function, but we've defined our function. So let's try to execute my function the same way that we execute print, but then because we don't have any inputs, we'll just have my function and return 1. So now let's talk about how we can give some inputs to my function. So let's define my function again, but then this time we have one input. And what I want to do is return my input plus 1. So what happened here? We have again defined my function, we're redefining the function, and inside the parentheses we're putting one input. And we can then use this input inside the statement block within the function. So whatever you feed the inputs when you call the function, this value is available as the variable myInput inside the function block. So we can do this, my function 2, and return 3, because we've fed an input of 2 into my function, and because we've defined our function correctly, we automatically get the value of whatever that is fed into my function as a variable myInput. As a result, we can then use this variable and add 1 to it and piping it into our outputs by the return statement, and hence when we call my function 2, we'll get 3. So notice a few things here. If we call my function without any inputs, Python will give us a type error. It says, type error, my function missing one required positional argument, myInput. So if you have defined an input, you cannot not provide that input, right? Similarly, you cannot provide more than one input because it would then throw another type error. It says my function takes one positional argument, but 2 were given. So that's also not good. Another thing to notice is my function actually has a type. So if we go type my function, without the parentheses, it would tell us that my function is a type function. However, if we execute my function by giving it the parentheses, it would then, missing the input again, it would then tell us that the type is an int, because the typing here is actually reflecting the typing of the output, and not whatever my function is. And the reason why we're typing the outputs is because when we're executing my function using the parentheses and giving it the input, Python actually executes my function, resolves this highlighted code segment into the return value, and then calling type on the return value. And that is why the type of my function 12 is an int, because my function 12 returns 13, which is an int. And that's all there is to it. So we have defined what is functions. So functions are small segments of code that are wrapped within a function header, starting with the keyword def, D-E-F. A function can have inputs in the parentheses within the function signature, and then it can also return or output values using the return statement. We've seen how we can declare functions and also how we can return values. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the usage of functions in your code. I'll see you guys next time.